welcome back to another episode of Daylight About Africa. I'm your host, Numbe, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. As promised, in today's episode, we will be touching upon two of my favorite pillars, which are reclaiming the African story and Africa Builds. For those of you who haven't watched an episode of Daylight About Africa, the show is essentially broken up into pillars where we dive into different subjects that are polluting Africa's image, making it seem like the continent lacks potential. So the goal is essentially to shift your outlook on Africa and hopefully get you thinking about investing, especially considering Africa is and will be, for a while, the youngest continent on Earth. Reclaiming the African story means pushing back against those tired and ugly narratives that Africa is just a continent in need, always waiting for handouts or charity or someone else to just come and save it. That story is outdated and incomplete on this podcast. The pillar is about reminding the world and honestly just reminding ourselves that Africa isn't passive. It is powerful, strategic, has blueprints, not just dreams. From tech innovation to policy reform, from cultural exports to grassroots movements, Africans are building a future that isn't waiting on anyone's permission. And one thing that people often overlook, Africa's patience. That continent has watched others dominate the spotlight, take credit for ideas that weren't even theirs, and act like power only lives in the West. Reclaiming the story means putting the mic back in our hands and telling the truth loudly. In the pillar Africa Builds, that's where we talk about what Africa is actually doing. Building tech, launching startups, growing cities, running elections, planting trees, and going to space because hello, why not? Now, I know what some people are already thinking, Africa in space? But what about poverty? Let me ask you this. Did anyone tell Elon Musk to fix homelessness in LA before launching Tesla into orbit? No, didn't think so. So let's keep that same energy. This episode is about challenging diaspora perceptions too, especially for Gen Z, because a lot of us grew up thinking Africa is only behind and that it's still trying to catch up. But here's the truth. Africa is not waiting for your validation. It's literally launching satellites while you're still debating whether or not to go visit in December. And yes, I'm going to break this all down because you deserve to understand what's really happening. On Daylight About Africa, we make the complex digestible, relatable, and a little disrespectful to the lie. So let's get into it. So let's start with the question that I mentioned earlier, and that tends to come up when Africa and a type of technological advancement are mentioned in the same sentence. Why is Africa even going to space? People ask this question like it's common sense, like it's obvious that a continent with so many problems shouldn't even be thinking about orbit, because Africa is dealing with poverty, unemployment, inconsistent electricity, lack of clean water, underfunded schools, overcrowded hospitals, unfinished roads, you name it. And yes, all of that is real. But did you also know that other countries have launched space programs in the middle of their own chaos? Oh my gosh. Newsflash. Let's talk about India for a second. In 2023, India made global headlines for launching a spacecraft on the moon, becoming the first country ever to reach the moon's south pole. But this is where context comes into play and is super important because as amazing as that sounds, over 700 million Indians, which is more than half of the country, still face seasonal or year-round water scarcity. And nearly 1 in 4 Indians live on less than $3.65 a day. Still, no one said, why are they in space? They said, wow, India's advancing. And if we look at the US, we love to throw NASA around like it was born out of peace and progress. But did you know that when the US landed on the moon in 1969, the country was literally on fire? There were civil rights protests erupting across the South, Black Americans fighting for the right to vote, access to education, and live free from segregation and police violence. In Jackson, Mississippi, protesters were marching for equal housing. In Chicago, people were protesting police brutality after the murder of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. And nationwide, students were protesting the Vietnam War, poverty, and racial injustice. Poverty rates were also near 13%, and in Black communities much higher. The Vietnam War was draining resources. Millions lacked access to healthcare or decent housing. But did they cancel the mission? No. They put a flag on the moon and called it a win for all of mankind. So why is it that when the US or India reaches for space, it's visionary? But when Africa does it, it's misplaced priorities? Who decided that African nations must fix everything before they're allowed to dream big? This mindset, I'm telling y'all, is a direct result of colonial powers painting Africa as primitive and underdeveloped to justify their domination. And Western media also only focuses on Africa suffering for decades, which concludes as to why this narrative is built around Africa not being in spaces like these. But it's 2025, y'all. And it's time we move on from that because space isn't a distraction, okay? It's part of the solution. And let's be honest, even in the diaspora, some of us have thought it too because we've been conditioned to believe that Africa's problems are too urgent, too basic, too broken to even think about something as extra as space. We need to decondition our minds, first of all, and understand that space is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And Africa is right on time. We also need to unlearn this Hollywood idea of what a space program looks like. It's not about moon boots, Mars colonies, or Interstellar, the movie. Most African space programs aren't even focused on sending people into space. They're focused on satellites, data, and real-world solutions. And why does that matter? For one, climate. Africa is the most vulnerable region to climate change, but it has the least access to early warning systems. From floods in Mozambique to droughts in Ethiopia, lives are being lost because we don't have real-time data. But satellites change that. They track rainfall, deforestation, erosion, all the things that directly affect food, health, and shelter. And you know how your weather app says it might rain and then it doesn't? That's bad data. Now imagine that happening on a national scale where the stakes are literally life and death. Also, food security. Did you know that farming is the backbone of many African economies? And with satellites, we can predict droughts, track soil quality, detect pests, forecast crop yields. That means farmers can plan better, governments can prepare sooner, and crises can be prevented instead of reacted to. Also, space programs mean connectivity. Millions of rural Africans still lack internet or cell service. That means no school, no telemedicine, no remote work. Low orbit satellites fix that, and fast. But here's the kicker. Who controls the satellites? Controls the data. And if Africa is renting that access from China or the US, we're back in that same cycle of dependency. So yes, owning our own tech is a non-negotiable. And sovereignty. Let's talk about sovereignty for a second. You cannot protect what you cannot see. Nigeria, South Africa, and Algeria all have named national security as a motivation. Illegal fishing, border surveillance, counterterrorism, resource tracking. Satellites give you eyes on your land. It's not about militarization. It's about visibility. And finally, my last reasoning as to why we need to decolonize our minds and why this logic makes no sense is that space is cheaper than you think. Gone are the days when a satellite costs billions. Now, CubeSat, which is like the size of a shoebox, can launch for under $500,000. Ghana did it. Kenya did it. Ethiopia is actually training students to do it. This isn't sci-fi. This is the now. And why now? Because more than half of Africa's population is under the age of 25. And they're not dreaming. They're building. This is about strategy, sovereignty, survival. And the story is just getting started. All right, so enough theory. Let me introduce you to the players. Well, I'm gonna call Nigeria the OGs. So they have something called the National Space Research and Development Agency, and they've been in the game since 2003. Like, yes, while the rest of us were still in diapers, they have launched multiple satellites for everything from disaster monitoring to urban planning to broadband access. And get this, one of their satellites, NigeriaSat X, was designed and built by Nigerian engineers. Not outsourced, not borrowed, but built by Nigerians. They even partnered with China to improve telecommunications, and their long-term goal, to train and send the first Nigerian astronaut into space. That is just beautiful. That is amazing. And in the country of South Africa, we're going to call South Africa the scientists, okay? So they have SANSA, which is the South African National Space Agency, and they are so big on space weather forecasting and STEM development. They launched a satellite built by high school students. Also, South Africa is home to Meerkat, which is one of the world's most advanced radio telescopes. Basically, they're listening to the universe like it's Spotify Wrapped. And they've been training women in space science, pushing African leadership in tech. Now, the architect in this game is Egypt. They are playing long game energy. Their space agency, EXA, is not only active, it hosts the headquarters of the African Space Agency. So let me repeat that. For y'all who didn't hear that in the back. The Continental Space HQ is in Cairo. They're not stopping there. They're also building an entire space city just outside the capital. Think Wakanda, but with actual government funding. They've launched satellites for Earth observation and education, and they're building partnerships with China, Russia, and Germany. Now, I'm going to call this one the silent operator. Algeria, come to the front. No one's really checking for Algeria in the space convo, I'm not going to lie, but they should be. And you know why? They've launched 5 satellites, and they're still building their own satellite development center. They're using space tech for agriculture, resource management, and environmental monitoring. That is smart, quiet, and effective. Now, this player, I'm going to call it the student turned star, Ghana. I mean, my Ghanaians now to come to the front. Ghana actually launched its first satellite in 2017. And here's the thing that made it special. It was built by university students. First time engineers, no big budget, no Hollywood storyline, just straight up grind. The satellite is called Ghana Sat 1, and it's used to monitor Ghana's coastline and environmental activity. And since then, they've expanded education in satellite engineering and have been vocal about African led innovation. Now, the last player, I'm going to call it the fast climber, Kenya. Kenya joined the game in 2018, but do not mistake them for latecomers. They have launched nano satellites, formed the Kenya Space Agency, and they're making moves in Earth observation and agriculture monitoring. They're also tapping into youth training, opening programs for young engineers, coders, and space researchers. Basically, Kenya said, we might have pulled up late, but we leaving with a trophy, okay? And now all of these countries that you hear working to do things in space, really cool things for their environment and their people, it's continental. Say hello to the Africa Space Agency, the AFSA, created by the African Union in 2016. They are headquartered in Egypt, but representing all of us. AFSA is about pooling knowledge, sharing satellite data, coordinating launches, avoiding duplicated costs, and building a pan-African space future. Think of it as like African Avengers of space. But instead of saving Earth from Thanos, they're helping us monitor it, feed it, and connect it and reclaim it. Okay, so we've talked about agencies, satellites, and the continental game plan, but let's bring it back to Earth, because at the end of the day, this is not about astronauts. It's about farmers, nurses, students, teachers, real people, guys. The ones who do not care what a CubeSat is. They just want crops that grow, kids who stay in school, roads that do not flood, internet that does not buffer. So let's talk about what space looks like in real life. Now, in 2019, Cyclone Idai hit Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. It was one of the deadliest and costliest tropical cyclones to ever strike the southern hemisphere, and over 1,000 people lost their lives. More than 2 million people were affected. Roads were gone, power grids failed, entire neighborhoods were submerged. So how did emergency response teams know where to go? Through satellite imagery. Some of it from African satellites, others from partners like the UN Satellite Center. These images gave real-time overviews of which areas were most flooded, which roads were still accessible, and where people were trapped. That's what helped guided helicopters, food convoys, and medics. And without the satellite data, relief would have been slower, less targeted, and more lives would have been lost. In Nigeria, rural access to education and healthcare is also a very big challenge, and there are communities that are off the grid. They have no broadband, no digital resources, and barely any infrastructure. Now, Nigeria ComSat 1R, Nigeria's communication satellite, has been used to deliver broadband internet to rural schools, power telemedicine centers, where remote doctors consult patients via video, and connect community resource hubs in areas that mobile towers do not reach. There are even pilot projects bringing e-learning platforms to villages, places where kids used to walk miles just to get to school, and now they're doing interactive digital lessons through satellite-powered Wi-Fi. And remember, NICOMSAT was designed and launched by Nigerians in partnership with China. This is homegrown tech serving local needs. Now let's go back to Kenya. About 80% of Kenya is arid or semi-arid. That means farming is already tough. It's really difficult. And when you add climate change to the mix, it's survival mode, right? And Kenya has been using space-based tools to help its farmers adapt. For example, the Kenya Space Agencies and partners like a NASA and USAID initiative, I believe by the name SERVIR, SERVIR, use satellite data to monitor drought risk, soil moisture, and vegetation health. And that information gets shared with farmers so they know when to plant, what to plant, and how to protect its crops. And in 2021, Kenya launched a system called the Crop Monitor using satellite data to help the government target food aid to areas at risk of crop failure. This is not abstract, y'all. This is feeding people in real time. And also, Kenya's thinking ahead, investing in student satellite engineering programs and national launch capabilities to build on this momentum. Now, let's talk education, because this might be the most exciting part. In Ghana, the country's first satellite that we referred to earlier in this podcast, GhanaSat 1, wasn't built by a mega government lab. It was built by 3 university students from All Nations University in collaboration with Japan. And they were trained from scratch. They learned the physics, the design, the the communication systems, and they made it happen. And that satellite was launched in 2017, and it's been used to monitor Ghana's coastline for erosion and illegal mining. Meanwhile, the students in South Africa who launched the satellite as part of the Cubes in Space program are literally coding systems that would go into orbit. And in Ethiopia, at the Entoto Observatory, students are now studying astrophysics and remote sensing in a country that only launched its first satellite in 2019. This all matters, y'all. Why? Because every satellite launch is also launching STEM jobs, innovation jobs, curriculum upgrades, career pipelines for the next generation. And it's not just for engineers. The space economy needs coders, satellite operators, data analysts, policy experts, climate modelers, even communicators and educators to tell these stories and shape public understanding. You don't need to wear a lab coat to be part of this future. There's room for everyone. And that's the beauty of it. This is what it looks like when Africa doesn't just consume tech, but it curates, it controls, and uses it to protect its people. This is how you empower a generation. So yeah, satellites are saving lives, powering schools, feeding communities, and launching careers. This is already happening. Not in theory, not someday, right now. But this begs the question, if this is what's happening on the ground, then what are we doing in the diaspora? Because knowing all of this and still talking about Africa like it's a charity case is wild. I'm not even gonna lie. At some point, the conversation has to move from pity to partnership, from vibes to actual strategies. And too often, diaspora support sounds like empty energy. I want to give back. I want to go back. I want to start something. But sometimes even our good intentions are built around ourselves, our timelines, our dreams, our savior acts. And if your idea of supporting Africa still centers you, that's not solidarity. That is saviorism. So what does real support actually look like? For one, I'm going to need y'all to respect African expertise. Not everything needs to be imported, fixed, or reimagined through a Western lens, okay? That perspective is important, but you need to keep in mind that there are brilliant engineers, farmers, data analysts, and educators who are already doing the work. They don't need you to lead. They just need you to listen and respect what already exists. Also, invest in infrastructure, not just the moments. It's one thing to build a library, but then it's another thing to ask, how does that library stay open when the lights go out? Infrastructure is what sustains movements, not Instagrammable handovers. Also, start sharing what does not go viral. We are so quick to repost trauma and tragedy, which, don't get me wrong, there is so much going on in the world and it's very sad, and we need to bring awareness to a lot of things. But when it comes to specifically Africa, like, let me ask you, will you repost a story about a young girl in Uganda using satellite data to forecast floods in her village? I didn't think so. Okay, you might, but I'm just trying to say that those stories need volume too, okay? And also follow the engineers, not just the influencers. But if your feed is full of travel and vibes and Love Island clips, that's cool, right? But balance it with the people building the future of the continent. Let your timeline reflect your values. Let your clicks uplift something beyond aesthetics. And if you really love Africa, your love gotta be useful, not romantic, not nostalgic, useful. That means amplifying what works. That means trusting African solutions, showing up without taking over, because the continent isn't waiting for a hero. It's already building its own future. But the question is, will you watch it happen, or are you gonna lock in? But anyways, that all goes to say, Africa's not stopping here. If anything, this space chapter, it's just the prologue, okay? Because the next phase looks like locally built satellites, space science taught in schools and universities, more women in STEM, a fully operational African space agency, and even private African space startups. They're not trying to copy NASA. They're not chasing cloud. They're trying to build what works for them. And satellites that warn before floods hit, programs that train teenage girls in robotics and remote sensing, tech that protects forests, coastlines, and defends food systems. This is Afrofuturism, not just as aesthetics, but as an infrastructure, education, policy, as a plan. And the best part is that you are not too late. Whether you're in the diaspora or on the continent, in STEM or not, there's space in this future for you. Get it? There's space to invest, right? To amplify, build, and show up. And Africa isn't waiting for permission. It's already launching, all right? Well, this is the end of the podcast, but if you made it this far, thank you so much. This episode, by the way, was not about space. It was about story and how Africa is reclaiming every space. Get it? The puns it was once excluded from. It's about saying we're not grounded in struggle. We were always meant to soar. So whether you're in Accra or Atlanta, Nairobi, New York, Boston, the question isn't if Africa will rise. It's whether you will rise with it. So thank you again for listening to another episode of They Lied About Africa. If you felt this, learned something, or had your perspective shifted, subscribe wherever you're listening and leave a review. It helps more than you know. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at They Lied About Africa. And if you want to dive deeper, all the sources, links, and extras in the episode description. Until next time.